Hello there everyone, we're back to the lore videos, and we're back to the history of Skaven. All I've done so far is a little intro on the Skaven, and then my kind of, it's basically it was a drama video, I suppose, more than a lore video. A dramatised lore video. The reading of the Doom of Kevzar. But I'm glad that went down well, and I will take into account your feedback on that, so thanks for that. But as I was saying in the intro video, this kind of ties into what I was talking about, because do you remember how we were saying how the writers of the Games Workshop are so advanced that they when they create these species and these races, they get right into their brains and they kind of, I was going to say reverse engineer them, but really it's normal engineering them, like forward motion engineering them, because I suppose that's where you would start. But it feels like a lot of other fantasy does the reverse engineering. Yeah, they go outward from the brain, and this kind of persona or personality that they've created for the race, and then it's almost as if they create that first, and then they think, okay, well, what would this be like if we had a race existing with this mentality? And also, needless to say, they've got a lot of history experts on their team. They just must do, because everything's so grounded in reality, and there's so many parallels between the general events and what has happened on Earth, which is one of the ways that they've created this realism that makes the events resonate with you on a higher level than other fantasy books, where they just kind of think, oh, wouldn't it be cool if this happened? Instead, there just seems to be a lot more thought going into it and a lot more attempt at realism, which is why this is awesome. It's up there with Lord of the Rings, in my opinion, because when you write fantasy, and also the Belgariad is kind of like this as well, it's when you write fantasy to this level where it's you're creating history, if you know what I mean. Like, it's not really even fantasy anymore, it's just the history of a universe that's different to ours. But the area where Warhammer pits these other two at the post, the Belgariad and Lord of the Rings, is there's a lot more completely fucking wacky shit that happens in Warhammer Fantasy, but they still manage to edge it. Like, if you think about how many unique races they have, and the amount of weird shit that happens, like all these spells that change the world and stuff, the fact that they still manage to keep up this amount of realism is incredible. Whoa, there's a parallel dimension! That's where chaos comes from, right? That sounds kind of cringy in itself, and I've tried to explain that to people before, and they've thought, like, as soon as you say, oh, there's this parallel dimension, usually when that plot device is used, it's the most cringy shit ever. But they've just done it in a perfect way. But anyway, let's kind of try to dial back the autism a little bit, and we will begin the history of the Skaven. Keeping in mind what we said about the psychology of the Skaven having an impact on their culture, this means the Skaven care little for the past, and they do not keep any recorded history. For a Skaven, there are only two times worth thinking about. The first is right now, when they are not ruling the world, and then the second is very soon, when they will be. The only history the Skaven do consider worthy of thought is personal rather than racial. One might recall such things as the glory days when he rose in power in his sect, or the despicable enemy that brought about his downfall. But rarely would he think about his origins, or any great achievements of any Skaven other than himself. They have no rituals or remembrances of their dead, for the Skaven are a jealous breed, and would rather undermine their fellows than praise them for their achievements. Beyond this, they have no real or consistent concept of time, nor dates, nor years, generations, or ages. Therefore, the history of the Skaven remains unknown, and mostly unknowable to the inhabitants of the Old World. The Skaven themselves do not care about it, and the few humans who make an effort to collect and catalogue it find themselves facing insurmountable difficulties, besides the fact that none of the other humans are going to believe them that the Skaven even exist. And these difficulties with collecting the information are the fact that the only humans with any knowledge about the Skaven are the ones who witnessed the culmination of the Skaven plans and somehow managed to live to tell the tale of it. Remember how we talked about how the Skaven assault cities from below, coming out of the sewers, and they rarely leave survivors to pass on the information of the Rat Men to the rest of the humanity. Moreover, it is clear that many human agents, for both nefarious and well-intentioned reasons, have actively purged or altered what few records exist of the Rat Men's actions, and persecute those who search these areas too deeply. Whatever the case, what little bits of the history that can be gathered about the Skaven are often taken from scripts and folklore, from tales and legends passed down by generations from times long ago. And we saw what it says here about how the Empire has been known to take away information about the Skaven or to persecute those who research it. Don't let that take the idea out of your mind that the Skaven might have a hand in repressing the information, because they surely wouldn't be above bribing people to get their way. Also, here's another nugget for you. I was looking up and researching the Skaven capital city of Skaven Blight, because I had a little tickle in my nose, and I smelt a lead afoot, because you know we found out the Doom of Kavzar, if you've listened to that video. If you haven't, go listen to it, because it's kind of part of this whole lore series. The Doom of Kavzar refers to this huge city that was in Tilea, and I think we can be pretty sure that Skaven Blight is the former Kavzar that was overrun by the Skaven, although it seems like it's completely unrecognisable now. Around the former city of Kazvar, now called Skaven Blight, the plains around the city would turn to mush and mud as the endless rainfall during the Curse of 13 has brought the once verdant plains into nothing but swamplands. Well past the borders of these swampy regions are found deep water channels where rotting slave hulks, great barges the size of Empire villages, ply along the murky flow. These ships moved through the swamps by using massive rowing oars or ingenious water turbines that propel the ships through the murky waters of the swamp. It is within these massive barges that slaves beyond counting reside, where they are forced by their masters to gather the meagre foodstuff still available within the land. Vast flotillas of Skaven slaves would be launched out of the main fleet, where scores of slaves would scour the vast reed beds for any small amount of foul and decaying crop still growing there. Such demand for the crop has ensured that the overseers continuously lash at their slaves to meet up with the quota before they move on. Since the blighted marsh is near impossible to traverse, the worst punishment any grain slave can suffer is to be abandoned in that stinking quagmire, where many hidden nightmare of the swamp kill those left behind. Once having gathered a sufficient amount of crop, the fleet of barges would row closer towards the swamp's interior, where ruined towers punctuate the murky waters to signal their destination. As the banks further in become more solid and stable, a teeming mass of ports and docks are built, where endless trudging lines of bent-backed figures haul black corn or moon seeds from quaysides to the mills and factories. Massive mill wheels of worm-eaten wood and rusted iron relentlessly churn out grain to feed the starving hordes of Skaven Blight. It is often common for patrolling groups of Skaven warriors to enforce more speed upon the tired and maimed workers and slaves, mercilessly threatening and hurting those that flagged behind. They would also gather those that died from overexhaustion, throwing them into the grinder to be mixed with the grain. So there we go, that's a description of modern day Skaven Blight. But now, we're going to cast our minds back into history, back to the formation of the Skaven race. Little is known about the earliest records concerning the origins of the Children of the Horned Rat, after they overran the city that has become Skaven Blight. Some speculate that they began to war amongst themselves for dominance over the resources of the city. Others think that they began to seek out deposits of warpstone in the tunnels beneath them. Regardless, it wasn't until around 1,600 years before the coming of Sigmar that the first true Skaven began to emerge from the pits beneath the ruined city. The Skaven population during those earlier times also began to rapidly grow at an alarming rate, despite the widespread starvation, infighting and disease outbreaks that were still rampant in the city. Pressures began to mount as food and living space became scarce commodities for the burgeoning populace, forcing the Skaven leadership to find alternative ways to expand their domain. The thought of venturing onto the surface world was discarded, due to the fact that the old world was far too dangerous to travel, as it was inhabited by dangerous beasts and the powerful tribes of both barbarian human and marauding greenskins. In a grandiose scheme, the Skaven sorcerers of the city came up with a plan to open up tunnels beneath the surface and carve out an underground empire, over which only they will reign supreme. All of their considerable quantities of warpstone were gathered together to power a crude machine in the hope of amplifying the sorcerer's formidable power in their undertaking of a grand ritual. Deep beneath Skaven Blight, this great incantation began. The diabolical device of spinning wheels, whirling gears, and makeshift power accumulators throbbed and smoked as it absorbed the magnified raw magic for the sorcerer's ritual. The ground shook, and the groans of shifting rocks almost drowned out the shrill climax of the chanting seers. High above them, with the crumbling monuments of the city, the great bell tower tolled as the structure swayed and creaked like the mast of a ship at sea. Power began to accumulate in such vast quantities that it had the potential to break mountains and shake the very world to its foundations. Then, for the first time, but far from the last, the great machine of the Skaven failed them. As an unknown part of the ingenious yet imperfect device broke down at the most critical moment, in that very instant, catastrophe struck. With a blinding white flash of pure malevolence, a tidal wave of raw magical energy swept through the underground chambers of the city and unleashed its power upon the foundations of the world. Tunnels collapsed, buildings fell, and the land began to heave and tremble. The entire undermined plain surrounding Skaven Blight sank as geysers of flame erupted from the tortured ground. The damage was even more devastating as the energies swept outwards. Soon the whole of the old world began to crumble as the titanic force erupted in all directions. The World Edge Mountains began to buckle under the relentless assault, as the surging energy crashed against the spine of the entire mountain range. Great tidal waves rose from the ocean and washed over all in their path. Long dormant volcanoes erupted to life from the east, and the lands there were forever scarred by geysers, lava and earthquakes. To the dwarves of the Everlasting Realm, their very civilization was being destroyed right in front of their very eyes. The catastrophe was an ill-prepared event, and those that knew about the horrible time remember it only as the Time of Woes.